Hello and welcome to my NSOET Party Compositions guide. This guide is linked with the run-through of the dungeon, an explanation of bosses, which can be found in the link in the description. Spoiler warnings now, if you do care about the stats of the dungeons, please don't watch this video. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the stats, or your stats get reduced in this dungeon by quite a lot. Now, it's important you still cap your crit, your speed, and your death in this dungeon. The ways that you can do this are obviously just using buffs like ult, tonics, food, blah 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 blah. You can also do your stories, prez to increase them a lot. You can put points into weapon spec, and specifically to cap defense, you can use best defense, which is recommended. And you can use Iron Wall, however, I would not recommend doing this if you can help it. The three pillars of doing damage in this dungeon are going to be having good raw DPS, are going to be having good death shred, and are going to be having good damage taken. So for raw DPS, I'm not going to go into specifically what builds you should be going. Obviously, you need to be plus 30. Obviously, you need to have the correct gear, blah, 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 blah. In terms of classes to bring for damage, it goes without saying that Lancer is going to be the highest DPS. You don't need a Lancer, you can bring other things. Other good choices are DPS bows, DPS shurikens, and generally anyone who is very, very geared. Okay? So, what specifically do DPS need to be thinking about before trying to attempt this dungeon? Well, first of all, they need to have as high a penetration as possible. It's not required to have 61% pen, because the reduction is only 135, so if you do have 60 or 59, it's only a few percent less. However, the more penetration you have, the slightly more you're going to do and the extra edge you're going to have. So I do recommend 61% pen. Elemental gear. Now, of course, it goes without saying that you should be using your bottom trophy as the elemental damage of your class. For example, for a dark class, say Lancer, use the dark one, Storm for like Shuriken, Storm one. Your top trophy should be damage to elemental target, providing it's not the same element as you. If it is the same element as you, of course you use your violent trophy, which is normally Storm of the Abyss. As well as this, you should also be aiming to swap somewhere between 1 and 3 other elemental things. You can get away with 1, but I recommend at least 2 or 3. Now, what are the other things you can swap? And this mainly applies to the DPS, not the supports, okay? The big DPS, so the Lancer, the Shuriken, whatever your main DPS is, this is what this applies to. I mean switching, like, your emblem, switching your mount, switching your hat piece, switching your eidolon, okay? If you have low boss damage, which will normally be when you haven't finished your stories, or you're still running all 3%, you don't have any 4% damage secret stones, or you're not running Hades wine because you need the stats, and any of these kind of things, okay, will add up to make your boss damage low. If your boss damage is relatively low, I'm talking under 120, don't hold me to that. It's not a straight line. It's a, more is better, less is worse. But if you do have low boss damage, then don't switch your elemental, or don't switch elemental hat pieces, because this dungeon has 105% boss damage reduction, so it's important to keep that stat relatively high so that you are doing increased damage from that. Okay? The next thing is the Death Shred. So, defense in this dungeon ranges from 24,000 to 30,500 plus 70. Why do we say plus 70? Effectively, normally the way that defense works is you can reduce it with percentage shred down to 50% of its original defense value, okay? What plus 70% means is instead of having 100% original death value, it has 170. Now, obviously, this means instead of only being able to reduce it by 50%, you can now reduce it by 120. So, how do we work out how much death we're actually shredding? So, we get the 170, we reduce it by our total percentage shred, so add up, your break deaths, your sword buffs, debuffs, your bow debuffs, blah, 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 blah. Okay, say you had 95% total, then you'd reduce it by 95. Then you have 75. From the 75, you take the 30,500, which is the original defense of the boss, and then you just times it by that value. Okay, so you'd have 22,875. From there, you take away the total amount of flat shred you have. Say you had 15,000, you would reduce it by 15,000, and the boss would have a remainder of 7,875 defense. Okay, you don't actually need to do this calculation every time, but that's just to give you an idea as to how it works when building a composition. Now, classes that give a lot of death shred are Tachi, Bow, and Sorcerer. There are other classes that that have good shreds. Most classes will have some type of shred. You just need to be keeping track of what you do have and making sure that you have a well-rounded amount of them so that you will most of the time be reducing the boss's defense to 0. If you don't quite get there, it's not important, but you should be aiming to reduce that value to 0. Damage taken, the third point. Basically, this counts as the general damage reduction of mobs. We actually also have this stat. The default value for mobs in this dungeon is 10%, so you will do 90% of your damage. This value can go negative, so if they have, for example, minus 30% general damage reduction, then they will take 30% increased damage, which means that we want to be stacking as much of this as possible, because normally it's just basically dependent on what class composition you have, as well as which eidolons you're running, okay? So if you have a HS, main or sub, they can be running that mastery. If you have a Lancer, they can also be running that mastery. If you have a Shuriken, they can run a mastery. So like I say, sources of this, Shuriken, HS, Lancer mastery. Sorcerer has it in their Envoy, Bow has it in their Envoy, and Eidolons such as Hades, Red Murasame, Nidhogg all have this kind of reduction as well. Again, there's no definitely hit this value, but the more of it you can bring from your class composition, the better. Extra things to note are that you can build around dark classes, or you should be building around dark classes most of the time. One, because Lancer is the highest DPS class, and it will normally be your carry. Two, because there is a lot of extra dark buffs in this game. So Nidhogg, Tsukuyomi, and Sultry Nidhogg are all dark Eidolons. Eidolon stories obviously have a massive buff over other classes. It's like 15 versus 51 in some cases. And your S5 bow also gives a dark damage taken proc. Now, why is it so important to bring dark damage taken? The reason for this is, unlike damage of dark skills, it is a separate increase that doesn't have a lot of bonuses, okay? So if you had, for example, 30% damage of dark skills, okay, this is going to stack with your weapon bonus, your Eidolon dark skills, your mount, your emblem, all these kind of things, okay? So you normally have probably about 150 of this. So if you had 30% bonus, it would be, 2.5 times reduced, which probably means it's, 12% damage bonus. However, if you have a 30% damage taken from dark skills on a boss, they don't actually have anything else on this normally. So it's just a 30% straight damage increase. So 2.5 times more effective. Sorry if that's a bit confusing, but TLDR, damage taken from dark, way better than damage of dark skills. The 3 sources currently for this, for dark, is going to be Sultry Nidhogg, and the S5 bow. Obviously, if you're running a Shuriken, you need to be using Sif because it has that. If you're running a Lightning class, for example, use Seiryu, fairly self-explanatory. Sorcerers and bows also have an extra buff, or an extra zeal buff, which makes them even better for supporting. Basically what I'm trying to say here is sorcerers and bows are extremely good supports. Most of you know this already, but there you go. That's another reason as to why they are. The one extra thing to think about when you're doing this, or making a party composition, is where the heals are coming from, or more importantly, the bard main or sub. Most of the time you'll want this to be a bard sub, to increase your maximum DPS, without having to waste that slot for the bard. If you are bard sub or bard main, do make sure you're paying attention to your party. It's not any one person's responsibility to keep the party alive. Of course, if you have a non-lancer that has a bard sub, it's more preferable they heal, but every single bard sub should be making sure they're prioritizing keeping people alive, because the more they die, the less stats they have, and the more when they are dead, they can't be debuffing the boss, they can't be doing damage, and the more dead people you have, the less likely you are to be able to clear it, okay? So I can't stress this enough. Make sure you keep people alive. If they are standing in red carpets and taking way too much damage, then they're probably going to die anyway, don't feel too bad. But if they're not getting healed for like 10 plus seconds at a time, that's kind of unacceptable. Again, this partners with the guide that I linked in the description, which will go through the key times to heal in certain fights, okay? Before I finish this video, I quickly want to round it out with what my ideal class composition is if I had to choose 5 classes, and the reason for this. So, First, I would bring a Sorcerer, who is using the 85 Manticores set, which gives +8 damage taken. They're using 2 Defense Shred trophies, normally Ring and Spawners. And they are using Lancer Sub with the Lamenting Carol mastery. Okay, they are also using Nidhogg as their Eidolon. The next one would be Bow. This is going to have HS Sub using the Smiting Repentance mastery. They're going to be using the S5 accessory set. Trophies are just going to be DPS, and the Eidolon will be Sultry Nidhogg. The next is going to be a Lancer with HS Sub. They're going to be using Joyful Carol mastery. The charge they're going to be doing on HS is going to be the Dragon Slash, and they're going to be using Elemental Eidolons. The next one is going to be a second Lancer, okay, who is using Joyful Mastery as well, is using either Elemental Eidolons or Tsukuyomi. I think I prefer Elemental Eidolons, but Tsukuyomi is also a solid choice here. And then they have Bard Sub, but they're not the main healer. Okay, and then the final class, in my opinion, should be Shuriken, who is using Bard Sub as the main healer because they have slots in their rotation. They should still be using full DPS gear, but their Eidolon should be Red Murasame. That's just my personal opinion, because I think that's the optimal way to get as much damage taken out of your party whilst not sacrificing DPS for it, because I think a Shuriken is still a solid DPS, but provides that 34% extra damage taken, which is a massive utility. So yeah, if you have any other opinions, or if you have a different opinion on what your ideal class composition is, pre-buffs to the classes like Duelist, they haven't been buffed yet. If you do have opinions on that, please let me know in the comments. If you do have any other questions, you can either comment it here or message me on Discord if you do have my Discord, or ask in unofficial, which is linked in some of my other videos. And yeah, the link in the description to the walkthrough. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.